Welcome to the Register's editorial board. We're here today with Bob Krause, who's running in the Democratic primary for U.S. Senate. And we'll begin by having everyone in the room introduce themselves.
I'm Clark Kaufman. I'm an editorial writer here at the paper.
Yeah.
Carol Hunter, news director.
Yeah.
Hannah Backstrom, politics editor.
Jason Noble, political reporter.
Kathy Obradovich, political columnist.
Brian Smith, engagement editor.
Emily Nash, executive editor.
Okay.
And I'm Lynn Hicks. I think I forgot to say my name, the opinion editor. And Bob, we start out every time just asking the candidates to very briefly say why we should consider endorsing you.
Why you should consider endorsing me? Well, I think usually it's why should you vote for me?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is, I guess, why. I'll answer that question first. Why should you vote for me? And one thing is I have the breadth of experience that is very unique. I have both a domestic policy background and a foreign policy background. For my 28 years in the military, I traveled to Korea, where I participated in writing the war plans over there for U.S. Forces Korea. I also was in Panama, where I participated in a top secret study of the drug war right after Just Cause. Spent a fair amount of time overseas in Europe, back and forth on various military exercises, both before and after the wall came down. And I spent a couple of months in Dubai as a transportation advisor to the government of Dubai. So I've had a breadth in that particular area that no one else can come close to in this field. And I think that in a situation where the nation has been at war for approximately 15 years now, that having someone in that seat that has personal knowledge of the Middle East, that has talked war and studied war for 28 years, I think it's going to be a significant advantage. Domestically, I've proven myself to be a producer. In my 6 years in the legislature, Arnie Garson, when he was here, you might remember him, did his little study, and I came out as one of the top 10 most effective legislators in the legislature, I think it was, under his study. And I think Branstad was one of the other ones that was in there as a top 10. I passed, at the time, one of the largest, it was the largest gas tax in history. It doesn't compare to the 10 cent now, but back in 1978 it was a 3-cent gas tax, biggest in the history of the country. And we used it as a lever to completely rearrange the road system. We created functional classification where we realigned between state, federal, and local. We had money that went for public transit, which was a first for Iowa. I also was involved in, it was my bill to create the rural public transit system, the little senior and disabled vehicles that you see around. That was mine. It was ultimately adopted by 28 states by their own hand, and then ultimately it became a requirement of the Federal Transit Administration to create these regional systems. So I proved I was a producer. And then I ran for Treasurer of State in 1978, which was very akin to 2014. I said 1914 because that was the beginning of World War I, which was another disaster. But anyhow, so yeah, it was a bad year. I lost. And I went to work for Jimmy Carter, ultimately, as regional head of the U.S. DOT. I was in charge of 28 states for the reorganization of the Rock Island, the Milwaukee bankruptcy of those two railroads. The charge was that it couldn't be a public system like Conrail. So we had to figure out what to do to maintain service to as many people as we could. Ultimately, my key recommendation was it was collapsing too fast, and so they had to do a money injection to keep it going for, I think it was like another 90 days. That was sufficient. The railroad both railroads were broken into their segments. The lines were taken over by other carriers. It went very smoothly, and about 98% of the shippers on the lines maintained service. And I think we lost maybe about 10% of the track or something like that. So we did I think, and I was part of it because I was in the field, kind of maneuvering. There were a lot of people in Washington that were working on it too, but it was a success. And then at the same time, because I was knowledgeable on railroad issues, I was familiar with what was causing the national decline, and that was it was overt regulation. We set the rates, and then the trucks were unregulated to various degrees, and so they would always use the railroad rate as a benchmark, and then they would go under. And that was really the cause of the entire collapse. So another job that I had was to sell railroad deregulation to the agricultural community. And I was successful enough that Secretary Goldschmidt gave me a letter of commendation for it because it was a tough sell, but we got it done. And since nobody talks about bankrupt railroads. We talk about bigger railroads hauling a lot of stuff, but we don't talk about bankrupt railroads. So domestically, I think I've proven myself as a producer at the federal level and at the state level. I've been a school board member, and in that time I learned a lot about the structure of the school board and education in Iowa, and which gets me to my final point, which when I talk about why the voters need to elect me in the Iowa Democratic Party, and that's because my central focus has been the collapse of the middle class and in poverty. I was the first person to come out for a significant minimum wage increase back in 2013. In fact, in 2013, I had a hamburger ad on my videos. And there was, at the time we had determined, and I don't know the prices now, they change, but we were looking at the minimum wage in Iowa and the United States, which was 7.25, and we were looking at the minimum wage in Australia, which at the time I think was around 14, 15 bucks. And there was 15 cents worth of difference between a Big Mac over here and a Big Mac over there. Ours was more expensive at the cheaper rate for labor. And so we did a little video on it. But when you get to what is happening in Iowa, we've had a very real decline, probably disproportionate to a lot of other states because we had so much manufacturing. When NAFTA came and when the World Trade Organizations came in, we lost a lot of factories. And you probably know that, Len, as business editor, how many of those factories you lost. You go through Ertl, Maytag, Electrolux, there's Rubbermaid, yeah, and it just goes on and on and on. And it's affected us not only because a lot of those jobs were good paying and things went down, but it also affected our agricultural community because a lot of small farmers would moonlight. Either they or their spouse would moonlight at these little factories. So when there was a symbiotic relationship, when the factories went out, it was a death knell for a lot of little farmers, not because of the rates on corn or beans, but because that was a supplemental income. Nationally, the decline since NAFTA and WTO and CAFTA for wage earners, not for salary earners, but wage earners, is about $1,800 per year. That's significant. And of course, people on minimum wage, they'll never get above minimum wage in most cases because of that. And in Iowa, that decline has really started to impact us. In education, as an example, it's about 42% of our children in Iowa are eligible for the free and reduced lunch program. One of Culver's last Department of Education Studies, which was released like in January of Branstad's second term, indicated that kids below the threshold for introduced lunch scored 20 points less on their standardized tests. And Science Magazine did a study that indicates that they lose about 13% on the average on their IQs, which is not recoverable, and that is primarily because of that stress of poverty. So if you want to know what the most important education issue is in Iowa, it's reducing poverty at the bottom, because that's where we got to go to spend the time. You know, if you think about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and pretty much anybody in journalism is familiar with it. You know, you've got the subsistence level at the bottom and self-actualization at the top, and a bunch of layers in the cake between. But where are our working poor, and what do? Well, our working poor are the people that are stringing 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs together, and they're not worried about politics. Often they're not even prioritizing their kids because they're prioritizing getting food on the table and rent paid. When I was a Waterloo School Board member, I would hear anecdotal stories of this all the time about elementary school kids that would go from, in a single semester, maybe move 2, 3, 4 times because the mom or the dad or whoever was sleeping on a couch with the brother or the sister or the aunt or the uncle. And these minimum wage jobs tend to be very unstable. They come, they go, they know you have very little rights, so often it's my way or the highway. There's very little forgiveness. Go on.
Let's talk a little bit more about your income and what you can do in Congress or in the Senate in that regard. I mean, you talked about minimum wage, trade deals. You're very clearly you've said TPP
I'm opposed to the TPP,
So
and I think.
What do you think? I mean, obviously there's Iowa agriculture would benefit. So what would your approach be to more fair trade deals or just oppose?
Fair trade is critical, but look at the history of NAFTA. It's a perfect example of a train wreck. It was sold largely to the farmers on the fact that corn would go up, and it did. But what happened was that with NAFTA, it went into central Mexico, and it destabilized all the campesinos down there. They couldn't make it, their farms closed, and all of a sudden they were looking to feed their families, and they came up across the border. And it was a big wave when it happened. A lot of the issues concerning immigration began with NAFTA, and they did not begin for good reasons. That they were coming up here because it was all sunshine and lollipops. They were coming up here because they were starving, and they had no other choice. So what is going to happen with the Trans-Pacific Partnership? They call it NAFTA on steroids, and I think that's true. NAFTA, one of the elements that the AFL-CIO has a big bone to pick about, and I think it was a Central America country, and actually it was under CAFTA, which is a parallel thing. But their union organizers were being murdered. And I think it was Guatemala, but it could have been Honduras, I can't remember. And so they complained to the cognizant oversight entity, and they said they had no jurisdiction. Now there was a little tag in there that says you have the right to organize, but if that right is of no value if your organizers are getting murdered. And when you're dealing with a lot of the third world countries, the rule of law may extend to the national capital, but not much beyond. And that's why I think a one-on-one approach is better. I think that in terms of what we can do with our excess corn and our excess beans, is we can process them and we can create a lot more jobs. When I was in the state legislature and I passed that gas tax, one of the things that was on it was the first ethanol exemption. And we went to, I went to the fiscal bureau and say, wow, how much is this going to cost? And he says, it's nothing. And the reason was that not a single gallon of ethanol was sold in the state at that time. So it was a zero fiscal impact. Now, today, 47% of Iowa's corn goes to ethanol. And it's not only a critical enhancer for farm incomes, but it's also a big factor in the stopgap approach that we have to global warming. A lot of people don't realize, but the alternate, the reason that ethanol came in was that it was, you had the Clean Air Act.
Right.
And you had to have oxygenates. And if you remember when, in your callow youth, and you would hear all these stories about smog in Los Angeles and smog in Salt Lake City, and then all of a sudden, 20, 30 years later, Arnold Schwarzenegger is saying the Clean Air Act is the greatest thing since the invention of the free sandwich. And why did it happen? It happened because we were able to inject those oxygenates. And ethanol is the most efficient oxygen. To get an E10 standard on oxygenation with ETB or MTBE, depending on some variables, it takes about 13 to 17% volumetric equivalent. So with that 10%, you get a lot for what you're paying for in terms of oxygenates. Now, in terms of the efficiencies, I think that the conversion rate is around, I think right now it's like one gallon of fuel, crude derivative will give you about 2.7 gallons of ethanol. So it's efficient as an energy, but the mistake I think everybody has made is that energy was really not why it was there. It was there because it was an oxygen.
Right.
And if you eliminate ethanol, you've got to go to MTBE or ETBE, and they are all produced in Louisiana, Texas, Saudi Arabia. So you do a pop of, depending on how you do your math, say maybe 7 to 13%, almost instant pop in the amount of fossil fuel that you are consuming. The reason that Ted Krause wants it, he wants it because he's got all those oil guys, and oil is at the bottom. You take out ethanol, you take out their number one competitor, and you send all the money down to Texas. You don't have to spend it up in Iowa. That's why they want to do it. And he may say that, well, this is it's inefficient fuel, yada, 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 but the real reason is the oil guys don't like it. And if you take off RFS, what will happen is the monopoly in the distribution system that is already present for crude oil and gasoline will suck it up. Because what happens in your distribution system now with ethanol is that ethanol is inserted into the fuel at the tanker level. So say there's a pipeline coming up to Kansas City or someplace like that, Kansas City, Des Moines, wherever it is, and they're getting ready to go out to the gas stations. They'll take that oil off the pipeline or that gasoline or whatever it is. They'll inject the ethanol at that point. So the entire distribution system up to the point where that tanker comes up and goes underneath the thing and they screw the nozzle in and all that kind of stuff, it's all owned by the oil companies. So they can knock out ethanol lickety-split without the RFS standard. I say the best solution is to increase, at least on the first step, to E15. Now, some people say that that's not good for the environment, but I say that we're fighting the wrong battle. When you talk about the clean water, you talk about the soil conservation, we're always going to grow corn in Iowa. How we are going to grow corn in Iowa is the issue, and that's what it needs to be. If you say let's eliminate ethanol because our soil is getting dirty, or our water is getting dirty, and our soil is depleting. Our water has been getting dirty, and our soil has been depleting since I was a young boy. You go back to Earl Butts in 1972, fence row to fence row for exports. Right. You go back to the early 70s, you were talking about, they just invented the Roundup like herbs or herbicides. We've been doing bad things for years. Ethanol has been come around in the last 20 years, and it did create a spike, just like when we got into exports big. But the growth of the efficiency of the grain has overcome that value.
So how
If you're going to go after clean water, which is the next
Yeah.
question,
Yeah.
you're going to have to go after the practices, and that will take some regulation. I agree with the Des Moines Waterworks lawsuit because I think it's going to force an accommodation. Now, the thing that a lot of people don't understand is that the 4 counties they went after, they're in the Raccoon River watershed, because that's where most of Des Moines' water comes from. You still have the same problem up in Kossuth County or these others, but that's going down into the Des Moines River Basin, and there you have a settling pond. It's called the Saylorville Reservoir. And so you've got some things that are naturally mechanics that we put in for that somewhat mitigate the water coming out of that. Not completely, but some of it. And then you've got 2 issues. You talk about nitrates and that the blue baby things that also occur with blue baby hogs, blue baby cattle, blue baby foxes, blue baby ducks. A lot of things are affected, by the injection of the nitrates into the water. And that can be regulated with the swaths along the edge. It can be regulated by wetlands. They've even got digesters. There was one, Bruce Behringer, he's a state legislator from Northeast Iowa. And he says, well, you've got this huge situation where you're going to lose 40% of your forests in Iowa almost because of the ash trees or the urban forests are going to disappear and they're going to have to be redone. They did an experiment up in his area with digesters. They chipped the wood, put it in a big steel mesh and buried it, and the wood chips take the nitrates out of the water. So there's a lot of technologies that are there.
So the incentive would be, the regulation would force them, or are you looking?
You'd have to have a mix. I think the first place to look is where we have historically looked for regulation until, I can't remember, it was probably during the 90s when, it was actually in the early 2000s, when they decoupled the crop insurance from soil conservation. I think we need to recouple it, and we need to look at you've got to participate in if you want to have soil conservation, or if you want to have crop insurance, you're going to have to also participate in having a clean water plan for your farm. And I think we need to tie that to a master plan for the drainage districts. I think that the drainage districts are a creature of law, and they have their own special powers over the farmers in the area. So the drainage ditch entities are going to have to become a manager, similar to California, and they have their water districts out there. And the water districts in California used to be just a board where, okay, you get this much, you get this much, you get that much. And now they have more aggressive management styles, and they get into water conservation and stuff. The drainage districts need to be elevated, and that's going to take some financial aid to do.
What was the rationale for decoupling the soil conservation from the crop insurance?
I think it was kind of a libertarian thing. Don't bother me.
Yeah.
I'm doing what I can. It's my land, and it was it came from and then after it was decoupled, there was the president of the Farm Bureau at the time, and I can't remember his name. He went and he tried to get a resolution to basically recouple them during the reauthorization, and within a year they had his head. He was gone. Yeah, and that's ancient history, but not that ancient history. But it was the Farm Bureau membership that beat him on the floor. I think it was Craig somebody. I can't remember his name.
Craig, you mean the Iowa?
Yeah, the Iowa one. Yeah. And so that was an issue, and it came up from the rural grassroots. And so you've got that has to be but it as you already know, because you've been doing a lot of reporting on this, it's tremendously complicated, and it also deals with how we own the land. I grew up on Section 12 on the northeast quadrant of Independence Township in Palo Alto County. So I went back when I was doing my dad's estate, or the estate planning. The plat map, if I looked at that plat map for Independence Township, every section of land would have 5, 10, 15, 20 owners. If I looked at the rural farm directory, there was about 1 or none farms per square mile. And so you've got a massive disconnect between the operation of the land and the ownership of the land. And so what does the operator think? Well, he says, oh, I rent that land, it's not my responsibility. And the owner is sitting there saying, well, geez, I'm in California, I see this land once every year or two during a family reunion at the summer when it's covered with corn, so I really don't know the problem. And I don't read the Des Moines Register, I read the Los Angeles Times. And so there is a massive disconnect between the ownership and the operation of the land. Similar to the one that the Des Moines Register ran into when they had 15 owners under the old Des Moines Register building.
Yeah.
Caused the same kind of problems, So, and I don't know how to fix that one. I think that the diverse ownership of the land, in some ways, is a blessing because it keeps people tied to the land. But at other times, it dilutes responsibility. And I have no answer, but it is something that has to be considered. So where you stand, I think ultimately it will wind up as a compromise, but I think the lever for this Des Moines Water Works and for other people that are interested in this is the lawsuit. And I think at some point it'll run to a point where a compromise is done, but the lawsuit has to remain in place.
Is there a federal role in the water quality issue?
The issue, and Grassley has been brilliantly obfuscatory on this. I use that word because Kathy thinks I use too big a word sometimes. Yeah, it came out in one of your columns once. Well, I can't remember. I think it was obstreperousness. I used obstreperousness in a speech. That kind of triggered. So normally I do try to, but every now and then I got to throw in a word. It's non-point versus point. And the arguments that the Des Moines Water Works is making is that there is no such thing as a non-point source anymore if you've got a tile, Right. And it's a very good legal argument, because the judges always look for like kind, looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. It's a duck. Okay, so you got a tunnel or a culvert going into a waterway, and you got one with a manufacturing facility or a municipal plant or a farm. It all looks like a duck, And so they have to prove the other duck aspects. Does it have feathers? And if they do that in court, and there's a very good likely, somebody will declare that to be a duck. And Senator Grassley has been very opposed to reclassifying ag land as point pollution. Right. Because he doesn't want to have the farmers pay that extra nickel, and there, in defense of the farmers, there's some justice right now. The Des Moines Register reported that you've got the farmers on an average right now are losing about $100 an acre, and that of course you don't see it yet because I'm sure when they did that analysis that they were counting depreciation. So you stretch out the cost of the new combine, or you stretch out the cost of the new truck or whatever, and that carries you over. But you can only carry it over so long. We're not in an economic crisis in rural America, but you can see the belt notches go in a little bit. If you drive around in the spring, the fun toys that were all always on on the road looking to be purchased, you know, be it a snowmobile or a speedboat or something. So we are getting squeezed. And if we had like a bad drought, or if we just have continued low corn prices, that's why a lot of people were looking so desperately to E15. One of the things you have with corn is the fact that the growth in the volume in Iowa is about 7% per year, and we're really not adding 7% land every year. Mm-hmm. It's genetics, and it can go on forever. So the people that are trying to balance the prices say new markets, new markets. Well, corn is an inelastic commodity. It takes a lot to move the market. Well, an E15, a 5% or 1/3 increase in the amount of ethanol nationally would have an impact. You know, it would raise the price of corn. Right. But yeah, and you know, there's plenty of abuses out there, you know, including that 7% growth. You know, the continuous corn, especially with Roundup, is yielding some pretty nasty weeds. But you know what we used to use on those nasty weeds? We'd use rawhide gloves and pull them out. You know. And we may be in a world someday that we'll have to do that again. I'm not advising that. They say that organic farmers and chemical farmers will make about the same amount of income. So that's doable. The problem is that the organic farmers have to spend an hour or two a day extra, because there's a lot of extra work that's
sure.
in the mill.
For sure. So tell us about how you're reaching voters. And I have to say that I'm disappointed you didn't bring us any cookies today.
Well, my wife's got me on a diet.
Okay.
So it's all your fault, Vicki.
So tell us about how that's one way you're using those cookies and videos. And you, in fact, you told Kathy that you felt like there's a lot of the low information voters in the Democratic Party. Is that, what did you mean by that?
It's the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They're not stupid. They're stressed. And because of that, they don't have time for politics, honestly, often. If you go into a Democratic event or a Republican event, you're not going to find the PTSD vet that lives underneath the bridge, down by the Raccoon River. If you go in there, you're not going to find the single mom, hauling one kid on each hand and trying to find a babysitter so she can make a minimum wage. Those people are not participating, and there's a reason they're not participating, and it's because of economics. If you've got to spend, at 7.25, and let's look at what the living wage is, because there's a big misconception about the living wage. Some people say, well, it's time, I got a living wage, that means I can go to Florida, I can snap my suspenders, I can have a good time. That's not what a living wage is. A living wage is a wage that will get you to the point that you do not need SNAP, you do not need Section 8, you do not need the general poverty safety net programs we have. And it's depends, just somewhere about $25,000, $30,000 right in that zone. And obviously it will go up and down depending on how many people are in the household. Minimum wage, $15,000. So your $15,000 is what you'd make on a minimum wage if you worked an 8-hour day and it was steady. That's what you'd make, about $15,000. So you got an automatic, probably about $10,000 shortfall in your budget that has to be made up with earned income tax credit or something like that. So you've got a person that is working hard, trying to make a living, and they've got to depend on welfare to live. There's something wrong with that picture. What happens when we talk about the value of work and the pride that you get from doing a good job, but you got to go on welfare. In Wisconsin, there was a study done a couple of years ago about Walmarts, and the end result on it was a large Walmart. I think it was probably in Madison or someplace like that, and they calculated that the people working there required about $500,000 a year in federal and state subsidies to be around. And so you take that and you multiply that by all the Walmarts, the big boxes around, and all of a sudden you find out you got a lot of money. And it's coming out of the taxpayer's pocket, and it's not coming out of Walmart or any of the other big box stores or any of the other minimum wage companies. And of course, if I can pay 7.25 and you have to pay 15, then it hurts my bottom line. But if everybody has to pay the 15, and of course that's a 15 that's stepped up over time, there's no cutthroat competition that occurs between the entities, and you can actually lever it up. One of the problems we've seen is that since the 90s or even the 80s, we've transitioned from grassroots economics to trickle-down economics. And interestingly, if you look at the graphs and how when it occurred, a lot of it occurred because of who was getting the gains from productivity. Until about 1980, right in that zone, productivity was divided. New, fresh productivity in the system was divided about equally between the worker and the stockholder. And then at 80 is when it started shifting. And between 1980, thereabouts, and today, the net increase in real income from productivity to the worker is about 15%. About 85% of it is going to the stockholder. And that is one of the reasons that incrementally you got that anger building up because of the stagnation. And if you look at the trade agreements, I think I talked about maybe I forgot to mention that the annual wage earner income has gone down about $1,800 per year since NAFTA and CAFTA. That's the wage earners. Now the salary people that do the marketing and let's fly over to Australia and sell them some tractors, they've done pretty good. But the wage earner has been depressed. If you want to look and see why Bernie Sanders has taken off, if you want to look at why Donald Trump has taken off, you've got to look at the wage earner because they are not happy. And the bottom half of the middle class is not happy. And that's where it's happening. And there's other statistics. Household income, which is a bigger, more, just a bigger number, has gone down since 2000 by about $1,500 a year. And that's for wage earners and salaried people in a bundle. And obviously some of that happened before before the big crash, and it's come up some since the big crash, but you got a net that's still on a downward bound scale. And so that's where it's at. And like education, unless you fix that nut, unless you fix the poor and the middle class and get that income where it's in some relationship to the wealth of the country, you can't do a lot. You can't do much with education because you're going to have a bunch of young kids whose parents are maybe not low information voters, but they're at the bottom of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which doesn't really sell. People go, duh, when you say that. But they're going to be low information voters, and you're not going to fix education. You look at what it's going to take to fix water. The first estimates are $500 million. And you got, oh, by the way, you got farmers that on corn are today losing about $100 an acre. Where are you going to find $500 million? Are you going to take it out of property taxes? Probably won't work very well. You probably shift people down into something else, or you'll cause a big farm bankruptcy if you force it. So you're going to have the money's got to come from somewhere. It's probably going to come some from the farmers, but it's not all going to come from the farmers because we'd bankrupt them, and they're not only are they economically significant in Iowa, but they're culturally significant. Nearly anybody that was raised in Iowa at this table probably has some relative that was a farmer at some time, a grandpa or an uncle or somebody, and that's tied to our social fabric. People that live in downtown Des Moines will still bleed for farmers if you go out in a bar and badmouth them. They'll be defending farmers, even if it's not in their economic interest. And so we've got to look at getting the incomes up enough so that we can get the revenues so we can do fixes. Clean water is a lot of job opportunity. You got to get the bulldozer in to make the wetlands, because we drained all our wetlands. You got to do some development to make those grass strips on either side. If you use digesters, you got to look at that. There are a lot of jobs to be had in cleaning up the water.
Let's talk about veterans. You've worked a lot of that over the years. So, what do you think, if you went to the Senate, what would be the focus there on veteran affairs?
Well, there's a couple of things. In my lifetime, I was too little to remember Korea, but I was a young boy and a man when Vietnam was on, and of course I've seen the 9/11. And with every war, you see a whole lot of flag waving. Right before the war, during the first part of the war, and then it's, oh well, how do we get out of here? And the attention on veterans' problems gets worse during and after the war. You look at, first you look at Vietnam, and we didn't even know what the heck post-traumatic stress disorder was. People were angry about the war, and they took it out on the vets. I used to hear all kinds of stories about vets, getting off the plane in San Francisco, and somebody calls them a baby killer, and they punch them out. In fact, there was one guy here in Des Moines, I won't mention his name, that did just that. And that attitude went into the VA system, and it started, you had a downhill. When the 9/11 war started, one of the ways that Principi paid for that, for the early surge in veterans health care, he eliminated services to a whole bunch of Vietnam veterans, because that way he had fresh money on his plate because Congress was not providing it. Shinseki got in trouble on money because he said, and he was a Vietnam vet, and he says, this is wrong. And he reinstated all those millions of Vietnam veterans that had been taken off the rolls. And it happened right on top of that surge of screwed up 9/11 veterans that had PTSD, traumatic brain injury, military sexual trauma, amputations, you name it. And so it doubled the crisis. The crisis was already incipient, but then it doubled it. And it doubled it for all the right reasons. And what happened is that Congress turned around and says, nah, not my problem. And Senator Grassley was right in the head of it. You know who was head of the most powerful committee in the Senate, the one that handles both taxation and appropriations? It was Senator Charles Grassley during that whole thing. He was the guy that was helped mastermind the split of to take the war in Iraq off budget. When the war was going on, if you look at the VA budget, it would go up about 10%, which is inflation plus 5, but it was totally unrealistic compared to what actually happened. And so I blame Senator Grassley for a great deal. In fact, when it really blew up was it was about 2008 when they had the Walter Reed debacle, and they had people living in unlivable buildings and stuff, and that was soldiers, but it made everybody look at the VA system too. And it was just massive neglect, benign neglect. It wasn't even benign neglect, it was massive neglect. And why wasn't it caught? It was because the people that were doing it, they had enough for guns, they had enough for bullets, they had enough for rockets, but they didn't have any money to fund psychiatrist education, psychologist education, any of the needs of the veterans. And there's a long ramp. Building up a service for education medical services is just like building a road. And I used to do a lot of road building because I was a planner. And we used to figure that we call it instant gratification if the road got completed 20 years after you started talking about it. And that's kind of where you're at with veterans health care.
So what do you need to do now?
What do we need to do now? Whenever there's a war, we need to have language in the war resolution binding the faith and good credit of the United States of America to pay for veterans' health care for the continuum. You've got a 70-year tail you're living with. And so instead of having the war and saying, oh yeah, we got these problems now, we need to plan it at the front end of the war. One thing it would do, it would spike the estimated cost of that war and would make some people think twice. We also need to stop taking wars off budget as an emergency. If we're going to do that, what happened with 9/11 and was a classic. It's, oh, they're off budget, and it became Candyland. And people would stick all their freebies and things they wanted into the war budget so it wouldn't show up. And now we're paying for that because the war budget is, mostly wound down, not completely.
Why do we need a separate VA system? Why not give veterans a card to use wherever they please? And
Well, I think the obvious reason is that war injuries are fairly unique and they're fairly massive. You don't have many general practice physicians that can even identify or are knowledgeable on post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, military sexual trauma. You might have a rape victim come in here and there, but you don't have a big quantity of rape victims. You don't have a big quantity of people that are crazy and paranoid walking in the door, And then if you put them out in the private sector community, Iowa needs 1,500 psychiatric beds. You know how many we have? We probably have under 600 today. Under 600 beds. So you're going to take these guys out of the VA system and you're going to put them in an underfunded system on the outside. Now, where's the justice on that? They're going to be standing in line with everybody else. Yeah, it's paid, but it's government paperwork. I got a private client. It was strange. My dad is starting to slide, and so we were going to get him home health care, and so he's VA eligible. And but the home health care agency up there says, we don't want to handle him because he's a high risk. And so I asked one of the healthcare ombudsmen I know, actually it was Kim Weaver, and she says, did you know you need to have a doctor's order? So we have to get a doctor's order, and then that takes the liability off the home health care agency so they can do it. But nobody ever told us because they really didn't want to do it. It was just more hassle. Yeah. And you get that. The one thing about the VA system, it is a club for these people. So not only with the PTSD, not only you get, and it's not a very good club. They tried to get another 1,000 psychiatrists, and they put an opening out, and they didn't hardly get any because they're not out on the market because they haven't been trained because they're not in existence. But then you get them. It used to be they give a PTSD vet an hour during a counseling session. They cut it down to half an hour nationwide because they don't have enough counselors. And so I guess, you have a cup of coffee and that's about what you get. And then take your pills. Early on, and they still do some of it, they have vet-to-vet, which is group counseling sessions, but you need trained facilitators to do that kind of stuff too. But how is a GP, a general practitioner, going to get a group of 10 to 20 PTSD veterans together to do group counseling? It's just not going to happen. And you're going to lose a lot of the synergies. You remember that the VA system was created for war injuries. It wasn't created specifically so if you had a flu, you could go in and get a flu shot. It was created for war injuries. John Bergman, who's one of the vice presidents at Hubble. You probably have met him. Perhaps you have too. But he was very active with his, when we were trying to get Knoxville as a facility. And he said, he's never been to war. I don't even know if he's got any family that's been in war. But he said somebody, when he was a little boy, took him down to, I think it was to Knoxville. And they had some PTSD veterans there. And there was one guy that he spent all his day carving happy faces on acorns. Then he'd give them away. But that's what he would do. And he said it made a great impression on him because, the guy couldn't do anything else. But he wanted to keep his hands busy, so that's what he would do. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of them like that. And that's why I've been such an advocate. Yeah, and I get stirred up on this issue.
Yeah. I understand.
But when they closed the VA, or not the VA, the residential medical beds or residential psychiatric beds, actually in Marshalltown. See, there is a regulation that gives the state homes long-term responsibility for long-term residential psychiatric housing, and as part of the big Walmart tax cut, Governor Branstad at the time and was hunting through the different agencies to get cash so that you could say he had a sack of money so he could bankroll the tax cuts. And and that was one of the agencies, And originally they used to have state funding of about $18 million a year. Last year, I think it sank down to about $3.5 million, and I think this year it's going to go up to $7 million, something like that. But that money was used to cover the gap with the younger vets. That was where that money came from. When they're 65 or older, the so-called nursing candidates, well, it's a group that has been self-cleansed. If you're going to commit suicide, you're probably going to do it a couple or 3 years after the war. If you're going to have Agent Orange cancer or you're going to have heart attacks, it's going to be in your 30s, 40s, and 50s and 60s. The average age of a Vietnam veteran on a projected life table is 63 years old. For the general population, it's 73. So by the time you get up to 65, most of those people that really have problems are out of the system. You got people that have problems because they're elderly and they need nursing home assistance, but you don't have that combat veteran. And so when you knock that extra money out, these people over 65 are paid for 100% by the federal government. Below that, it's negotiated depending upon what the disabilities are and where they're at, and it'll run probably 60-70% reimbursement from the feds. So the state has to pick up a chunk of change. Well, they don't have much to pick up anymore, and they've already gleaned out the system. Used to be you'd have people that would live in the state home for, they'd stay there for 15, 20, 30 years, some of them, and if you look at a PTSD vet, if you meet one, it might be a very pleasant person, but they may go off the rails for various reasons, and then they get obstreperous, they get pushy, they might sneak off campus to get drugs or booze or something like that. They're the problem children, and they didn't want those people, and they kind of pushed them aside. Says, well, it's somebody else's job. We'll take care of the ones that are easy, and that's what happened.
So you have this issue, this passion in common with Senator Ernst. Have you have you had a lot of experience working with her? And are you? I mean, what
there was? Yeah. Well, ironically, and I respect Senator Ernst's service very much. But when we were back in, I think it was around 2013, 2014, when we first raised the flag that there were problems at the Iowa Veterans Home. And I worked it in tandem with Darrell Beal, who at this time was the chair of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. And we had sources inside the home that I won't reveal because that's confidence, but were telling us about all these problems that were going on, and they were pretty nasty. And so I went to Darrell and I says, Darrell, I want to put out a call to have an investigation, a legislative investigation. Will you do it? And he said yes. And so we put out the call, and Senator Beal called a legislative hearing on it. And it went on, and a lot of the stuff that came up, burned people's ears. It was, there was sexual harassment, possibly some sexual abuse. There were a lot of different problems that surfaced at that time. And one of the key elements that we needed to continue with that was the subpoena power by the legislature. And Senator Ernst had agreed to be one of our votes because we needed some bipartisan votes to get that done. And the heat got put on her and she backed off. And that was why we never had subpoena power for that investigation. And ironically, when the ombudsman report came out, I think it was maybe last fall or something like that, one of the things that it said is that, well, we don't have enough evidence because we don't have subpoenas. Catch-22. Catch-22. What do you do? So there are still elements up there, and one of the most recent ones that I've talked about was the fact that it was the age discrimination issue that has popped up, and it was picked up by a couple of people. But what happened is we got a list of admission denials from the Iowa Veterans Home going back to 2007. It was a FOIA thing, and it's a long story of how we got it, but we got it. And we got it because we had heard from our inside sources that there were no young guys around anymore. Where did the young guys go? We just came out of a war. There should be some young guys here. And I have a friend, Dr. Max Shelley. He's head of the Department of Poli-Sci at Iowa State. And he was my instructor once upon a time. And in statistics, when I was doing some graduate work up there, and when I was at the Council of State Governments writing highway safety reports and such, he would do all my statistical analysis. So we took the admissions denial data, and he had some grad schools tabularize it in a fashion that he could do a SPSS run and a statistical package for the social sciences. And what we found was that the likelihood they were definitely discriminating at the 65 benchmark with an accuracy of, with a margin of error of 0.003, which would be 0.003 of 1%. So yeah, they're discriminating. Why they're discriminating? They're discriminating simply because they get a full boat, free ride for people over 65, but the guys under, they don't. They got to come up with state money, and the kitty is not dry, but it's pretty darn close. And that's where the problem is. And so that's what's sending Iowa veterans underneath bridges. And I will, win, lose, or draw on this race. Just plan to have me being mouthy for a couple of years.
So what is it going to take for you to win this race? What do you think you need to do?
Well, I've been talking to Jesus a lot. That's yeah. It's like I told Kathy. It's a revolution in politics that's going on today. When I go by the Des Moines Register, it says Register Media Company up there. And you've had people go out and you've made little low-cost video presentations, which are pretty nice. I like those. And the same thing is happening in just retail politics. 6 years ago when I ran, Twitter was only about 2 or 3 years old, and I got on it, and I had I probably had 500-600 people on my Twitter account by the end of the day. Today I got 3 times as many Twitter followers as Iowa Public Radio. So we just kept thunking at it. Facebook, we use a multiple strategy. You got the like pages, the fan pages, and then I got a couple other personal pages, and then we do a lot of cascading, sharing. You can do a lot of exponential campaigning that way, and then of course we do YouTube also, but the bread and butter for watching the video is probably Facebook, and it's just because we take it to the people, and I think the high number of video watches for a single video is maybe about 6,500 by now. There was one I've been watching. It was on the Supreme Court thing. But we've, you know, they'll run from 1 to 3,000 often, and they kind of nest and they sit for a while, and then you know, they'll just the watches will trickle in, and you can use them over and over again, and they are remarkably free, you know. And you know, as a politician, I understand the free lunch, and so it works, and that is and. I don't think anybody else is doing it like we are. Tom Fegan is, I think, the next best person on social media. But he's only got a couple, 2 or 3 active videos, you know, and they get good coverage. But he does a lot of print things, probably more than we do. We push the videos a little harder. When he goes out, it seems to be a lot of stills, and then it's separate events, which we do too. You know, I'm in Woodbury County, or I'm in Story County, and here's a picture, and we're all smiling, that kind of thing. And the nice thing about videos is they can give emotion, and they tend to draw people more. And a lot of people just, in this day and age, sorry, Des Moines Register, they don't like to read as much. And we train them early to do that, you know, with cartoons and such. And so we're reaching out in this way. And, you know, we just keep pushing those little videos out. One of these days we'll have something go viral, you know, and then I'll declare victory.
I watched the video of you hovering over your toilet and explaining the Medicare.
Oh yeah. Did you? Yeah, we redid that as a cookie thing. You knew that.
Oh, no, I don't know that.
Yeah,
I
there is. If you go back, yeah, the toilet thing it got too complicated. I decided, what we did. You probably haven't seen this, but Grassley was known for his great discovery of the $750 toilet seat,
sure.
which made him a real cost-cutting, budget-conscious kind of fella. You know, so I painted the toilet seat gold, and I kind of put it on my toilet seat.
With your wife's permission.
Yeah, with my wife's permission. Yeah, it didn't stay for long. Trust me.
Right.
Yeah, and then we had some information that indicated that the cost of not allowing Medicare to negotiate the price of prescription drugs nationally was about $50 billion a year. And that number came from a couple of different places. It could be more, could be less, but that was the number that seemed to be popping up. So we used 50 million. And at the time we did that one, it had been about 12 years, we figured. So we figured, well, 50 times 12, you know, that's about $600 billion. And oh, by the way, the war in Iraq was $800 billion over the life of the war. So you can say that Senator Grassley, by that single act, cost elderly and the taxpayers about almost the price of the Iraq War. And he didn't even have to declare war to do it, you know. He just, and at the time he did it, he had the second highest number of big pharma contributions of anybody in Washington. So it's not a nexus, and I understand from having been in the legislature that sometimes an interest will throw money at you just because they like you. So I'm not impugning his integrity, but I'm saying that he gave a giant windfall. That and to compare it, you know, remember it was, I think it was Ted Krause when he released his budget cutting plan. He says, I'm going to save the taxpayers $50 billion a year with this. Well, Grassley just lost it for him, you know, and it's still going on. And that one has to be cut. But so anyhow, so they didn't understand the toilet, you know, throwing in the pills, things like that. So I made a stack of cookies, you know, one stack of cookies was the $600 billion, and one stack of cookies was the Iraq War, and one stack of cookies was Afghanistan, and then I did my little dog and pony show, and I think that might have been the one. Was that, Kathy would know, was that where I hit my elbow against the cookies and they went tumbling? Okay, well anyhow, well yeah, watch it. There's even if I don't win, you're going to have to watch these because there'll be arcane humor in a few years.
All right, well, I think we are out of time, and so thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, well, thanks so much.
Okay.
Really good questions.
All right, thank you.
And I hope that, that vision hits you all, at the appropriate time, when you have that open ballot as to who you endorse.